We're continuing to build out our app. Our app is Top Stories app. The app is grabbing JSON data from the New York Times API. At some point, we all will be able to sign up to the New York Times API to get real data. Because right now, the data we have is a couple days old, right? Ideally, you want your app to be having the current data, right? We'll get into that very soon. In the next few days, we'll get into getting real data from an API real time, right? But for now, we're getting our feet wet with using JSON, parsing JSON, and using that JSON data into our application. Yesterday, we got introduced to different ways to get a JSON data into our application. We started off using JSON into playgrounds, right? Don't lose that skill. That skill is very valuable. Being able to get a short piece of JSON, put it in a playground, and see your model working and testing it out, that's a skill that you should all keep using because it's way easier. You see all the setup we had to do for an application, for this particular application. So if you have a JSON you want to test out, the fastest way is to create a Swift playground, get a piece of the JSON that you're interested in, model it using your struct or whatever, and test it out. Right? This is one page, very easy to test out what the JSON looks like with your model. So this was the first way. The second way, we created a JSON file. We grabbed the Top Stories technology section from the New York Times API. We put that JSON file into our app bundle, and we used the bundle class to read that JSON. So once we read that JSON, we got the contents of it. The contents of it, we created data, and that's what we really needed. We needed that raw data in order to use that data with JSON decoder to decode into our Swift object. Everybody, so far so good? There was a few steps we needed to do. First, our top level headlines data needed to conform to codable. Very important, it's required. If we remove codable here, we'll get an error because our Swift object no longer conforms to codable. And codable is very new. It was added to Swift via a protocol. That's the power of protocols. Protocols, you could extend any type that exists by creating a protocol, making that type conform to the protocol. Now you've extended that particular type. A similar example, an enum. Before case iterable, we were not able to know how many enum cases we had. What Apple did, they created a protocol, they called it case iterable. Now any enum conforms to case iterable, it automatically gets all cases. Very similar to codable here. Before codable, we used JSON serialization to parse JSON. And if you've seen that anywhere, or if you see that in the future, there's more verbose code there. There's a lot of like dictionary stuff you have to do, a lot of typecasting you have to do. It becomes very verbose, right, and tedious. But with codable, it's easier to read, easier to just get your JSON into Swift objects, very easy, right? As we saw yesterday, it's nested, which we had a nested JSON here. It's very easy to abstract that nested JSON into our Swift objects. So again, codable is very powerful. Great, so yesterday we were able to get our app. So far we have one page on our app. We have our custom cell. Our custom cell has two labels. One label is the title of the headline. The second label is the byline, like who wrote that story. And we have the image. We'll get into images later, but today, this morning, I want to talk about searching. We haven't seen the search bar UI yet, so today we'll start off by going to our UI for our table view, adding in a search bar, and making that search bar work based on what the user types in to search for that headline. So far, so good? Okay, so we'll start off by going to storyboard. We'll start off by going to our storyboard. And we'll change some constraints on our table view. So click on your table view, click on your size inspector. So we click on the table view, click on the size inspector, and we'll delete the constraint that says align to top. Go ahead, click on the constraint that says align to top. Our table view has 4 constraints. So click on the constraint that says align to top, click on it, and delete it. So right now we should have 3 constraints. We have trailing, leading, and bottom. Okay, So now what we'll do, we'll click on our table view. We'll click on our table view. We'll drag down the top of the table view. We'll drag it down enough, about here, that's okay. About 100 points, whatever it is. So drag it down. The purpose of doing that is we'll add in our search bar right above the table view. How you doing, David? Good so far? Everybody was able to delete that constraint and drag down your table view? Okay, let's go to our object library. Click on your object library and search bar. So search bar, we're gonna drag in the search bar right at the bottom of the navigation bar. So this is a search bar. It's called a UI search bar. The search bar enables the user to put in some text, and with our code we'll write later, the user is able to filter the table view's results. Okay? So this is where we headed, this is the objective. But for now, this is just the UI. So let's set the constraints for our search bar. So click on Add Constraints. Our search bar will set it 0 to the bottom of the bar, of the nav bar, 0 to the lead-in, and 0 to the trailing. So those are 3 constraints, and we'll go ahead and add those 3 constraints. Great. Next, we will go back to our table view. We'll snap our top of our table view to the bottom of the search bar. So the top of the table view, we snap it to the bottom of the search bar, and go back and add that top constraint back to 0. So click on your Add New Constraints for the table view. Click on the top constraint being 0, and click on Add One Constraint. Okay? At this point, we should have all our constraints set. Okay? Next step, we'll put some placeholder text in our search bar. So in our search bar, very similar to a text field, we could put in some placeholder text. So we'll put in some placeholder text here for our search bar. We'll click on the attributes inspector for the search bar. I'll go to where it says placeholder. Do we see placeholder? So in the placeholder text, I'll simply put in search for, or search by title. Press enter. Great. So I have my search bar, search by title. So far we're okay. We'll go ahead and we'll connect our search bar to our view controller class. There might be some more modifications we do later, but for now we have our search bar basically set up. So I will go to my assistant editor, and right below my table view. So in my assistant editor, I want to make sure that my newsfeed controller is visible, and I will control drag from my search bar in my storyboard over to my view controller class. So I will control drag from my search bar right below my table view. And for the name, I'll simply put in search bar, and I'll click connect. Okay. At this point, I'll close my assistant editor. We might come back to it later. We will come back to it later. I'll go back to my newsfeed controller and continue setting up my search bar. So like with so many UI elements we've seen before in Unit 2, the search bar also has a delegate. Right? Very similar to a text field, right? We need a delegate in order to know or to respond to the user's actions. For example, the user clicks the search bar button, we get a call in one of the methods. So the search bar has a delegate. We need to implement the delegate. We need to set ourselves as the object for that delegate. In other words, the person or the class listening to changes from the search bar. So we'll go ahead and set that up. Very similar to text field, very similar to text view, very similar to UI table view. We'll go ahead, we'll set a delegate. So we'll go to view load. Right below our table view here, right below our table view delegate, we'll simply type in UISearchBarDelegate equal to self. Right? So at this point, we do get an error because we are not conforming yet to the search bar. So we'll go ahead and we'll create an extension to conform to the UISearchBarDelegate. So far we've added the IB outlet for our search bar. We've set ourselves as the delegate. And next we'll go down, all the way down at the bottom of our class, we'll create an extension that conforms to UISearchBarDelegate. So let's go ahead and do that. So right after my UI table view delegate, I will create an extension here. Extends newsfeed controller, UISearchBarDelegate. Okay. The first function we'll use is search bar search button pressed or selected, whatever it is. So we'll go ahead and we'll start typing in search bar. We'll start typing in search bar, and as we've seen before, if you do conform to some delegate or data source, you'll see all the methods appearing as you start typing in that search bar method. So here we see search bar selected scope. That's not what we want. We want search bar search button clicked. So like the fourth method down, right? It says search bar search button clicked. Everybody sees that? So that's the one we're after now. So I'll click enter. Great. So this is the function that gets called. For now, we'll put in a simple print statement to see what happens. I'll put in search bar. Well, using string interpolation, we only have access to one argument or one parameter here. We have the search bar. This is the argument. One argument we have, the search bar itself. The search bar itself has properties. So the search bar has a property called text, right? As we see here, text is the current or starting search text. What the user actually typed in here, that's what we have. So I could say search bar text was entered. So again, we're keeping it simple. We're testing out if our search bar actually is set up correctly. If the user does click on the search bar, what happens, right? So the best way to explore any function is a print statement, see what's happening as you go along, okay? Or a breakpoint. Breakpoints are also good. We could have simply put a breakpoint here, and as it stopped here, we could have used PO, print out, to see what the values of the variables are. Any questions about breakpoints or print statements?
Where did you say you would put it?
Right where 63 is. And then when we click on the search bar, it would stop at that breakpoint, and then we could do PO in the debugger.
And we could see the text.
Yes, exactly. So you could use a print statement, or you could use breakpoints. And most times we come to your computers, what do we use? We use breakpoints to debug the code. Like, what's happening? How is it getting called? Is that function getting called? When it gets called, what's the values of the parameters? Right, that's how you explore code. Great, so let us run our app. Let's run our app, and here we have our search bar. We'll type in whatever it is. I'll type in Mac. I'll press the search bar, and look, so that works, right? In the console, we were able to see optional Mac was entered. Optional is an optional, search bar.text is an optional, right? Everybody was able to get that print statement in the console. Yes, sir? Question mark. What are we talking about? Right here? Right here?
Yes. I know it doesn't work.
I mean, it's a text, right? It's already implicitly, that's why we get this warning here. String interpolation produces a debug description because it's an optional. So we could use we could use nil coalescing to silence it. All right. Okay, was everybody able to get the print statement in the console before we move on? Okay, so at least now we're able to get to this point, right? We're able to add a search bar in our UI. We're able to connect our UI to our class view controller. we're able to set the delegate on our search bar. We're able to implement whatever required methods we want. It's up to us what we implement. There's no required methods on that protocol. As opposed to table view again, data source, that's the only protocol so far we've seen where there's required methods. Everybody with me? Okay? Besides that, most of them have been optionals. Optionals meaning it's up to us to implement that particular method. Okay, great. So we have our print statement working. This is great. Let's actually go ahead and figure out what the logic is. So when the user clicks on that search bar, what do we want to happen? Well, we want to basically filter our table view. We want to filter our table view and show the user the results of that filter. If the user entered, for example, if the user entered internet, for example, whatever has internet in the title, that's what we want to present to the user. Okay? So when the user clicks on that search button here, we want to filter our data for the table view. Okay? Great. So let's go ahead and write a simple filter function that does that. So let's go and write a function right below load data here. Right below load data, we'll write a function that filters. It filters based by whatever text the user entered. Whatever text the user entered, it's going to filter out the table view, or rather the data, the headlines data, it will filter that out. So let's go ahead and create like a FilterHeadlines function. Our FilterHeadlines function, what argument should it take?
Headlines, should take an array of news headlines.
An array of news headlines. What is the user typing in into the search bar? A string, right? That's all we really need here. Whatever they typed in, if I typed in internet, internet is a string. So my function takes in a string. Yes?
Also, but in order to filter through it, would it be that we already have our array of news headlines? Are we turning it into like an array of strings? Or like
No, we'll use our original array coming from our get headlines, this original array here, to filter, and then pass it to headlines. Okay?
Does it matter that it's a string optional? 'Cause
I'm sorry, say that again. No, we'll set that up. It won't be an optional by the time it gets there. Okay, good question. All right, so here we have filter headlines for search text. Search text is a string. Filter headlines for search text. So the user puts in whatever search text they want, and it's our job now to filter our data. So the data we'll use the original data that we have. So we'll say headlines data. Headlines data.get headlines returns us an array, correct? It returns us an array. But what do we need to do? We need to filter. Our function is called FilterHeadlines, right? So we'll use the filter closure. We'll use the filter function that takes in a trailing closure to continue our logic, right? So here we'll say filter. Each element in my get headlines now is what? What type? What type is my element now? In the curly bracket, what type is each element? What's that? It's a news headline, right, everybody? It's a news headline. News headlines have properties. Great. So we'll go ahead and we'll use shorthand syntax here. So $0. $0 is a news headline. On $0 we have properties. For now, we'll filter by title. We'll make sure that the title is lowercase by saying that lowercase on that string, right? And we'll say if that title contains if that title contains the search query or the search text, I probably should change it to search query. Doesn't matter, it's fine. If that title contains that search text, that lowercase, so at this point they're both lowercase, right? So we make sure that whatever the user types in doesn't matter, because my title will also be lowercase. So if I typed in internet uppercase I, N-T-E-N, whatever, the user typed in lowercase I, they're both the same. Everybody with me? Great. Cool. All right, so this is our filter headlines. So when our filter headlines returns this array, what happens is headlines gets called, headlines did set gets called, right, everybody? It reloads the table view. So now if I have a filter of 2 elements, my table view now has how many elements? 2 elements. Cool. Any questions? Any questions about filter headlines?
Just in general, filter headline is considered a helper function?
Yes. Cool, cool, cool. Okay. Yes, sir.
So if this is just for filtering headlines, I guess not just by title, would we have to make another one for, I guess we wanted to search by the writer?
We'll do that later, very good question. Later we'll see what's known as the scope titles, where you could have different titles or different scope titles. And then you could have different criteria, so whatever the user selects, then it filters by that, and we'll create like an enum, so it switches and it knows the current state of that search. Cool? A lot of things there, but we'll probably end on that there, talking about scope titles and what that looks like. Yes? A helper function is basically what we wrote there. It's a function that helps us to do something. It's, in the industry, it's known as helper functions, or utility functions, right? So it's a small function that does one task, which a function does anyway, but hey, just a helper function to filter our headlines for us. Yes?
What is this one called?
When is it called?
Yeah.
We'll call it when the user clicks on the search button.
So do we bring it into the extension?
Yeah, we could call it there, because remember the extension extends the type.
Okay.
So right now, any type that is type newsfeed controller has access to filter headlines.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Is it better to make a new array for the filtered stuff?
Anytime you make a new array, you create a new memory. So if you could, the less arrays you create, the better your program is.
Because then when you're calling to get the headline again, whatever you filter or
It's the same array, right? That's the same array, correct?
yeah, right, that's the same array.
Right. So we're using the same array. The more arrays you use, space complexity becomes bigger, right? Right now, our space complexity is n. So if we add more arrays, then we get more, our space complexity increases.
But right now, like whenever you do filter or not filter, you're always calling to get headlines or calling for the API.
In that case, we're not hitting the API, whatever, but we're getting the raw data from. But yes, if it was an API, you would get back whatever the API has.
So that would be better than creating a new array.
Anytime you could avoid creating a new array, it's better. Especially, yeah, anytime you could avoid creating new memory there for any program, it's better. It's more optimized. And if we're hitting an API, we could always cache the results of the API. Like with URL session, by default, it caches. So you could grab the cache as opposed to making more requests, because most APIs, they have a request limit, right? Okay, cool. So we have our filter headlines. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, sir.
Can you just go over again how doing the search makes the, like, goes to the delegate and reloads the data?
So yesterday we created our headlines data, right? Anytime headlines gets modified, the headlines, talking about property observer, the did set here, right? Anytime we change headlines, we change the value of it, our table view reloads, right? Using the did set property observer. Everybody, please, we all know that now, right? I want to make sure that we all, that's why I always tend to write property observer here. Property observer observes changes on headlines and updates the table view. Right? So that's the power of did set. You observe a property anytime you reassign that property, whatever the did set, whatever logic you have in that did set gets run. Okay? It's almost like a function there. Well, it's a closure. It just calls. It calls this, it executes whatever is in there. Yes? How we haven't set up the code for that. So here we have our search, right? When the user clicks on the search bar, that's where we'll have to call our filter. Right, everybody? So everybody, can we go down now to our search bar button click and continue the code? Because we haven't implemented that. We set up our functions and everything already, but we haven't implemented the actual filter data. Bless you. So when the user clicks on the search bar, what happens here is filter, we call filter headlines. Well, before we do that, Mr. Adan, let me answer your question. So our search bar .text is an optional. We love optionals, right? Yulia, right? It's an optional. We need to unwrap that optional. Yes, you could bang it because at what point will the thing be nil? I mean, it's like one of those Apple APIs, like, ugh. But we'll unwrap it using a guard statement. So we'll say guard, let search text equal to search bar dot text, right? It's an optional here. It's a string optional, so we're gonna wrap it using the guard. Else just return here. No need to crash the app here. We're not crashing it. We'll do something else here. So I'll keep a to do here for now. And here we have search text. So what do we need? We need to call our filter headlines now and pass it search text. Right, so user enters some search text, search query. They press the search button. The function unwraps the search bar.text. So at this point, search text has a value. Search text has a value, and we come to our filter headlines. We pass our filter headlines, the search text. I go to my filter headlines function. This gets called. My headlines, my get headlines array filters based on the title of the headline. If the title of the headline contains the text that the user entered, then we get results back. The results could be anywhere from 0 to whatever, right? 0 to 39 in that case, right? Because we have 39 headlines for now. So it could be anywhere from 0 to 39. Our headlines array gets updated. What gets called, Mr. Wan, when our headlines array gets updated? I'm sorry? Right. So didset gets activated, and didset, what's in didset, Mr. Jahid? What gets called in didset there? What happens when didset gets called on my headlines variable? It reloads the table view, right? So in that case, if the count of my table view, because anytime you say reload table view, what happens is the protocols get called. So number of rows get called. If it's 2, it knows it's expecting 2 rows. For each of those 2 rows, cell for row gets called, and it returns those 2 cells. So then our table view will have 2 cells. Everybody with me so far? Okay? A lot of moving parts, but this is what happens. Yeah? For our function, the filter function.
Yeah, we have a to-do, and when we said guard let search text equal search bar.text, else we have a to-do.
We'll come back to the to-do. The to-do is to do later.
Filter headlines for search text.
Right. So at this point, we have some text. The user entered some text. We have the text. We just call our function. All right. Let's go ahead and run the app, and let's see what's happening. Great. So here I have my search bar. If I go ahead and I type in internet, and I press my search bar, my search button, it's filters, right? I mean, there's probably more results here. Let's try to get SoftBank. So SoftBank, press return, right? So SoftBank returns one result. Was everybody able to test that, right?
My question is saying guard body was not going through consideration.
Was everybody able to get their table view being updated? Okay, yes, you have a question? You good? Okay, yes.
Is there a way to do it in real time?
Mr. Bienvenido asked the next question. Is there a way to do it in real time? Because Mr. Bienvenido doesn't want his user to type in search all the time. So we'll come to that now. Next question.
We also have to get it to like reset, right? It's right.
Yes, also reset if it's blank. All the questions. So 2 to-dos. Mr. Christian asked, if it's blank, what happens, right? So to do here, Bienvenido asked about real-time searching as the user types. And Mr. Christian asked about what happens when the search bar is empty. It's empty, right? That's what you asked for? Okay, so we'll answer those 2 questions. So for now, we all have our search bar button clicked function working, right? So when the user puts in some text here, they press the search bar, it updates, correct? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay, so let's go to a next function. Actually, let's go to the API documentation. I like to show us API documentation. Let's just see what search bar delegate looks like. UISearchBarDelegate, a collection of optional, right? They're all optional. A collection of optional methods that you implement to make a search bar control functional. It's a protocol. We'll get into writing our own protocols again very soon, where we have some view class, whatever, doing exactly what's happening here, right? Like you have your protocol methods, whatever. We'll get into that again. A UI search bar object provides the user interface for a search bar field, but it's the application's responsibility to, right, our responsibility to implement what happens in that search method. Managing the search text, right? Search bar text did change. Tells the delegate that the user changed the search text. Does that look familiar at all to anything that we've done before? It's a bit similar to should change, very similar to this one, right? So we'll implement the text did change, because this one actually happens as the user is typing, right? So that'll answer your question, sir. So we'll get to that one. So we'll implement text did change. Let's go ahead and do that. So here, start typing in text did change. Let me slap that out. I see people really doing good with bookmarks, so I'm gonna slack this one out and add it to like a search bar folder in your bookmarks. All right, so let's see what happens with that particular function. We'll test it using the same formula we did earlier. We'll have a simple print statement to say what search text is. So search text, search text. I'll come right back, but if we go back to the API documentation and we click on text did change here, let's see what it says. So most times Apple will tell you exactly what the parameters are doing. So here the search text is the current text, right? Current text. This is better than our text field, right? Our text field, we had to add text field plus string, remember? Faintly, right? So here our search text is the current text in the text field, right? Awesome. So let's go back here and let's run our app and see what happens. So we'll type into the search bar without pressing the search. We'll type into the search bar without pressing the search button. So let's go ahead and start typing. So here I'm going to type in INT, right? Are we able to see that?
Oh, and this is better than the technical result.
Right, yeah, because it gives you the exact contents of the search bar, right? So this is a function that will be very useful to us to answer Mr. Christian's question about real-time searching, right? So as the user is typing, I will filter my data. Okay? Cool. As the user is typing, I will filter my data. So let's go ahead and do that. What do we have? We have search text. It's not an optional, which is great. So can we just call filter results directly here with search text? All right, let's go ahead and test it. So run the app again. And let's start typing stuff in. So I'll type in internet, right? It's changing, correct? Is it changing for us? As we type internet, right? They're both internet here. But we have a problem. What happens here? That's your next question. What happens when the search bar is empty? We answered the first question, but we haven't answered the second question. Anybody, any clues? What should we do? So that first to do is gone. I'll simply take out that text here, and I'll put it down here. So this is what that function does, right? Real-time searching as the user types. But we have one more to do. What happens when the search bar is empty?
Is it possible that, is it possible to do, like, I don't know, like, if, would you, no, I don't know, if there's a way to say that, does it have an is empty property on?
Yes, there is. It's a string. We have is empty.
It's a string or bool, it's not a boolean?
Yes, it's a Boolean.
So if it's like, if search bar is empty, then would you just like, maybe if you save the original table.
All the things are coming together. Very good, Tiffany. So that answers Mr. Eric's question a couple of weeks ago, why we always have this load data here, right? So now we could use what you're saying. When the search bar text is empty, everybody, I could call my load data. What does load data do?
It gives you the
Original. Everybody with that, right? So those small functions become very useful, right? We had it from the beginning. We haven't used it yet, but today we'll get a chance to use it. The load data that Mr. Eric was asking about earlier. Why do we need that? So here is one of the cases where we'll need it, right? If it's empty, as Tiffany is pointing out, if that search text is empty, go ahead and get all our data back. And all our data comes from load data. If we look at our load data function, right, it gets all the headlines from our original model. Everybody? Cool, so let's go ahead and implement that. Very good. Give it up for Tiffany there. Excellent. Okay, cool, so let's refactor. We'd like to refactor code. Take this out. We'll say guard if not empty search text dot is empty else return, and filter data if we have something in the search text. In here for the return, right before the return, we'll call our load data, right? Because here we are empty, right? The search text is empty here. Search text is empty here. So we get back all the original headlines using our load data. Right? So here we're using guard. Again, guards are very powerful. We love guards. You don't love them, keep using them until you love them. So here we're saying guard, protect this. Only if it's not empty will we continue down to line 85. If it's empty, go ahead and execute the load data function, load data, gets back all the headlines from our model. So we're back to our 39 headlines.
Okay.
And in load data, it assigns it to headlines. Our headlines reloads the table view. Yes?
Can I talk to you? So we're saying that if search text that is empty, like if the search bar is
Uh-huh.
empty, is not true.
Right.
Then we want to go down and do filter headlines for search text.
Yeah, or you could read it saying if search text is not empty, right, which is what you just probably said. If it's not empty, go to 85.
Okay, else, no. So meaning the else is if it is empty. we'll do
Yes,
that.
exactly. And we have to put a return. We have to put a return here because we're using a guard. In a guard, the only way to exit is either have a return, have an exit, or have a fatal error. Here we have no reason to crash the app. This is totally valid. It's okay to have an empty search bar, but what do we do in that case, right? All right, let's go ahead and test it out. Okay, so here let's type in Fox. Right, so that works as before. Let's remove Fox here. And it goes back to all our results. Right? Was everybody able to test it? But now I have this annoying keyboard. I want to get rid of that keyboard. How do we get rid of that keyboard? Resign first responder is a good thing, right? So here, the minute we search, so we could resign first responder a couple ways. We could just resign first responder when the user clicks on the search bar. Resign first responder right here. Dismiss the keyboard. Search bar dot resign first responder, because the search bar is the first responder. Whatever is the first responder, that whatever object that brought up the keyboard, that's the object you use to resign the responder. In our case, the search bar is the one that brought up the keyboard, so we simply say resign first responder on the search bar. Let's go ahead and run the app again. And here we have, what should we search for now? Let's search for threat or Mac. Let's see if there's Mac in this. Hey, no, the Mac factory is in Texas. Cool, so we have Mac. If I go back here, click search, ooh, we have an error here. Next bug. So when I click the search bar, it searches for an empty string. Was everybody able to see that? Was everybody able to replicate that? Make your search bar empty and click on search. Do you get results? Do you get results? You guys want to fix it?
Yes.
Can you guys fix it? I'll give you a head start. So yeah. When we click on search here, it gives us an empty. So let's see what's happening here. When I click on search, it calls my filter headlines. I could simply write a guard statement here. I could say, back in my filter headlines, I could say guard against this being empty. So guard search text that is empty, return. So if this guy is not empty, keep going. If it is empty, return. Else return, sorry. So in my filter headlines, I'm guarding against my search bar calling some search query where it's empty. If it's empty, just simply return. I don't want to make that call. Right? So here, what are we doing? We guarding against an empty search query.
So you're guarding it before and then after.
All right, let's test this. All the edge cases, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and what do we have? We had Mac for now. Type in Mac here. Type in empty. Type in search. Right? So that fixed that. So far, so good?
I just wanna know for sure, what it returns, what exactly is it?
It just doesn't do anything.
Gotcha.
It exits the function, doesn't execute anything. So here we could say is return. Return here simply does nothing. Just exits the method. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, so if we, if let's say you press enter and there was nothing in there, wouldn't nothing happen anyway? Because it would be checking for things that don't contain, like for the.
Well, our particular query passes in empty. It doesn't return any results. So the table view will be empty.
Table view. So for like the search bar, the one on the bottom that we were filtering as we typed it in, for example.
This guy.
Yeah. So like.
This one is fine, but the one that broke our code was the search bar when you click on the search button.
Okay.
The search button broke it. This one is fine.
I just mean if I removed guard search X is empty, would anything different happen? Because even if you ran filtered headlines on an empty thing, it would show everything, wouldn't it?
If you run filter headlines, it's not going to show everything. Because if you search for something and you put in an empty string, you didn't find an empty string.
When I tried doing it, it was fine.
Did it work for the search bar as well? The search button?
Not for the one where you have to press enter, but for the one that you have to type.
So what do? You just remove the guard altogether? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying I'm not totally sure because it seems that when I
This particular one, what we did here, we protected it. If it's empty, just reload the table view. Because we did come to a case where the user, that first one here, what happens if the search bar is empty? Because when it was empty, we had no results. Right? When the user backspaced all the way to empty array, empty search bar, we had no results.
no results.
Right? That's why we protected it. If it's empty, load all the data again. Test that one. Remove your, or test your code such that you type in some query, you backspace all the way to empty state, and what does your table view do? Okay, so here we have what happens when the search bar is empty. We took care of that. Where did we take care of that? We took care of that here. Search bar is empty, good. So we are done with our to-dos. This to-do here, what are we doing here? We're not doing anything here. We're simply returning. As a matter of fact, we don't even really need, the only reason why we need this search button click here for now is to dismiss the keyboard. Everybody with me? So as a matter of fact, we could not allow the user to do anything here, just simply resign. Just simply resign the keyboard. And just keep it as real-time searching. I want to make sure that as we go into APIs, right, be careful with this method, right? Be careful with that method, unless you're using cache results. If you're using cache results, we'll talk about cache results, right? But every time you hit the API, when we talk more about APIs next week, anytime you hit an API, most APIs, if they're free, right, they start off being free as for the developer, we have about 1,000-ish requests for the day. So if you're using your API and you're making real-time searching, right? Before you get to half day, it's like, oh, you got to your quota already for the day, okay? So we'll talk about like what URL cache looks like as far as like searching your cache as opposed to making API requests. But just keep in mind that this function is awesome, right? But make sure that you know what data you using it against. Everybody with me? Cool? Our data is local, no problem. We could make million searches. There's no problem there. But when you start into like real APIs, like querying internet resources, that becomes expensive. Okay? Very good. Any other questions? We'll stop here. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the difference between view and editing versus the design first responder?
View that is edited is when the view is
And editing.
end editing. I don't really use view and editing, to be frank with you.
I use that to remove the keyboard instead of the first response.
I would stress on using Resign First Responder. I see that more as an interview question than end editing. Okay? So I would stick with Resign First Responder here, because that's what it is. It resigns that responder. I see that 99% of the times with interviews. Like, hey, if I want to dismiss the keyboard, what function does that? Yes?
So we had sections, we would have to.
Sections.
Like we had sections in our table, we would have to create another array that would have.
If it's well, first of all, our headlines is an array, a flat array, right?
Yeah.
If you have an array of arrays, it's the same basic principle. Like you just take care of your sections, your rows, everything is the same. It just goes one step further. There's nothing different. It's the same thing like we had our lab last week, where you selected a cell, it resectioned the table view. Very similar. You filter the array of arrays, right? Very similar. I could make a lab for you to test that out, but it's very similar. It just expands on using, instead of a flat array, filter the array of arrays, right? In that array of arrays, where does Mac exist? Return the sections with those rows, okay? All right, so we'll stop here. Unless we have any other questions, we'll stop here and we'll come back and we'll talk about scope titles that Mr. Brendan, was it you?
That was me.
Yeah, that Mr. Brendan brought up, right? Mr. Brendan was asking about how can we do different searches, as like are we writing different functions, right? So we'll come back and we'll talk about what search scopes looks like, or scope titles. Cool?